Some murderers wait in shadows, others kiss their victims goodnight. From the dusty plains of Australia to quiet Canadian neighborhoods and deep into the suburbs of the America, these 5 killers weren't just dangerous, they were deceptive. One lured lovers with fake terminal illness. One dissolved body parts in engine degreaser. Another? He sent wedding invitations with his victim's name still fresh in his basement freezer. These are 5 of the most ruthless serial killers from America, Canada, and Australia, and each one's darker than the last. Before we begin, tell us what country you're watching from in the comments, and please subscribe for more stories like this, because what you're about to hear, you won't find it on Netflix. Most people imagine serial killers hiding in basements or abandoned city buildings, not crouched beneath the rustling stalks of sugarcane fields. But that's where Graham Talbot operated. A former sugar mill technician in Queensland, Talbot was the kind of man who could blend into any crowd. A wiry, sun-tanned worker in his mid-40s with leathery skin from years under the Australian sun and a reputation for being quiet but helpful. To neighbors, he was just another cane cutter with grease under his fingernails and a rusted ute in his driveway. But behind that rough blue-collar exterior was a man with a taste for dismemberment, secrecy, and control. Talbot's story didn't start with rage. It started with loss. After his wife, Rebecca, left him for a local police officer, something in him snapped. But instead of confronting her or seeking therapy, Talbot found a darker outlet. He began frequenting dating forums under aliases like Country Strong 87 and Mick from Mackay, presenting himself as a lonely widower looking for companionship in rural Australia. He was persuasive, not romantic, but raw and vulnerable in a way that made his targets feel protective. He'd send voice notes describing his quiet evenings, photographs of his rustic home, heavily staged, and promises of peace away from the chaos of the cities. Women in their 30s and 40s, often single mothers or divorcees, responded, and that's when he'd make his move. He'd invite them for a weekend retreat, always to the same location, a now-defunct cane farmer's shack surrounded by 300 acres of dense, unharvested sugarcane, a property Talbot inherited from a dead uncle. There were no neighbors, no service, no way out. Once inside, the pattern was always the same. He'd welcome them in, offer tea or wine, and within hours shift into a colder version of himself, controlling, precise, dominant. If they tried to leave, he'd block the door. If they resisted, he used chloroform harvested from chemicals at his former mill. The killings were brutal, but not impulsive. He used industrial saws, the kind used to clear sugarcane stalks, to dismember bodies. Each victim was carefully tagged, not with names, but with coordinates, GPS markers to where their remains were buried. He stored these tags in glass jars on a shelf in the shack, dozens of them, dating back 5 years. Police would later call it a trophy wall made of dirt and digits. Talbot disposed of the remains beneath layers of freshly planted cane, timing his killings with the planting schedule so no one would disturb the soil. The acidity of the fertilizers sped up decomposition, and cane roots masked the shallow grave markers. It was genius in its cruelty. He almost got away with it, until one victim, a former schoolteacher named Michelle Hoyt, managed to trigger a backup location signal on her smartwatch before he drugged her. Her last ping showed a radius near Ingham. It took local authorities 3 weeks to correlate her online messages with Talbot's alias and another week to get a warrant. What they found shocked even hardened investigators. Not just a kill room, but a system. An industrial fan for airflow, cleaning chemicals organized by use, maps with pins, a manual logbook detailing each victim's physical reaction before death, and chillingly, a list of potential future targets, complete with their children's names, jobs, and locations. He had been planning a cross-country spree, Talbot didn't resist arrest. He smiled during the mugshot. At trial, he told the judge, "They all came looking for something. I just gave them what they wanted." To this day, Australian authorities believe Talbot may be linked to 17 disappearances between 2014 and 2021. Only 9 victims were confirmed. The rest? Buried somewhere in the cane, their GPS tags long corroded or lost. When police finally processed Graham Talbot's remote cane shack, what they uncovered wasn't just a crime scene, it was a shrine to psychological decay. The interior of the cabin had been modified like a surgical theater. Fluorescent lighting lined the low ceiling beams, and thick black tarps covered the floors and walls, stapled tightly to the wood. Investigators described the main room as eerily sterile, with a stainless steel table bolted to the center, equipped with drainage holes that funneled into makeshift buckets underneath. On a nearby shelf sat surgical gloves, rolls of plastic wrap, various sedatives in unlabeled vials, and a mounted camera pointed at the table. The footage it recorded was encrypted and unrecoverable, but experts believed Talbot was documenting the kills for his own twisted study. His logbook confirmed this. Each entry listed the victim's initials, the time of arrival, methods used, how long they remained conscious, and how cooperative they were before and during the kill. He noted who cried, who begged, who accepted it. One column chillingly tracked emotional decay, with check marks under categories like resigned, panic spiral, and false hope. On the walls were photographs, not of the victims, but of the sugarcane fields in different seasons. Lush, overgrown, scorched, replanted. Each shot marked the evolution of his burial grounds, taken from the same position atop a rusted watchtower just beyond the tree line. When questioned, Talbot said, "I wanted to see how nature took them back. Some places swallow bones, others spit them up." His eerie calmness didn't waver through trial. Prosecutors presented 3D renderings of the shack's interior, soil analyses from the burial plots, and forensic documentation tying DNA evidence to multiple victims. But Talbot never denied a single charge. Instead, he offered corrections to the timelines, challenging the prosecution's estimates on decomposition and site depth. The only time he showed visible emotion was when they mispronounced one of the alias names he'd used to lure a victim. That moment drew gasps in court. Media frenzy followed, especially when a photograph of the jar shelf, dozens of small mason jars filled with paper coordinates, was leaked online. Families of missing women traveled from across the country, hoping their loved one's location might match a jar. Police eventually released a public-facing spreadsheet of coordinates for confirmed victims, but many jars remained unclaimed. The true scale of Talbot's crimes may never be known. He was sentenced to 13 life terms without parole, though investigators believe the number of victims exceeds 20. Psychiatrists who examined him argued over his diagnosis. Some claimed he was a malignant narcissist who viewed human life as an equation. Others believed he had suffered a form of psychotic disassociation triggered by abandonment and compounded by environmental isolation. But Talbot himself dismissed all theories. In a final statement, he said, "They came here to disappear. I just followed through. The shack was burned down by court order, and the land remains unsold, overgrown with cane that no farmer dares harvest." Locals refer to the area as Widow's Hollow. His story would go on to inspire 3 books, 2 documentaries, and 1 graphic novel. But none captured the full horror of what he created beneath those sunlit fields. Because unlike most killers, Talbot didn't act out of compulsion. He acted out of ritual, out of intent, out of a cold understanding that if you lure someone far enough into silence, no one will hear them scream. Some murderers hide in remote cane fields and turn isolation into a weapon, but others don't need distance. just charm. In fact, the next killer thrived in crowded cities, using charisma as camouflage. While Graham Talbot relied on geography to erase his victims, this man used psychology to make them walk willingly into their own doom. Because when love becomes a tool and betrayal becomes motive, even the most ordinary man can become lethal. Michael Drew wasn't the kind of man people suspected. That was his power. Born and raised on the south side of Chicago, he had the clean look of a department store model. Sharp jawline, soft-spoken, always smelling faintly of citrus cologne. He worked as a marketing executive for a mid-tier ad agency and had no criminal record, no history of violence, and no one in his life who'd ever seen a flash of rage. But between 2009 and 2016, 5 women went missing, all of them connected by one invisible thread. They'd gone on dates with Michael Drew. He met them through dating apps. Nothing creepy, always professional, always polite. His profiles were curated to perfection. Tasteful photos, witty captions, a hint of vulnerability. Recovering from a divorce, trying to find myself again. That line hooked victims who were nurturing by nature, women who saw him not as a threat, but as someone worth healing. First dates were always at public places. Second dates were slower, more personal. Walking along Lake Michigan, visiting jazz clubs, or getting coffee at quiet bookstores. By the third date, Michael had built a narrative. He was a heartbroken man with a guarded soul, but he was opening up, and they were special. This emotional bait was his weapon. Every woman who disappeared had told a friend or family member something along the lines of, "I think he's the one." And then they were gone. No breakups, no clues, just missing. Police didn't link the cases at first. The victims were different ages, different backgrounds, and spaced out over several years. But in 2017, a maintenance worker found something strange while clearing out a storage unit set for demolition on the city's outskirts. Hidden behind a false wall was a sealed interior chamber, padded with soundproof foam, and inside it, a chair. Not a torture device. Just an ordinary worn-out armchair facing a mounted camera. Nearby, boxes of videotapes labeled with women's names. Police reviewed the footage and discovered something far worse than torture. Psychological manipulation recorded frame by frame. Michael never physically harmed them on tape. Instead, he filmed hours of intimate conversations where he emotionally broke them down, whispering things like, "No one's looking for you. They always leave, and this is where you become real." The tapes would end abruptly, always before anything physical occurred. But in follow-up investigations, police found blood traces in the chair padding, shallow graves near the unit, and receipts tying Michael to the storage rental. Once arrested, his digital trail unraveled everything. Deleted app messages, carefully wiped GPS data, and recovery files showed how he had tracked each woman's emotional weak points before striking. The motive wasn't sexual, it was control. He needed to be loved completely, then destroy the one who gave it. During trial, prosecutors dubbed him the Chicago Suitor. Michael sat in court calm as ever, defending his actions as therapy sessions with closure. His lawyers argued mental illness, dissociation from childhood trauma, but the jury didn't buy it. He was convicted on 5 counts of murder, and prosecutors believe more tapes exist, stored elsewhere or destroyed. Today, the storage unit is condemned, the chair was burned, but families of the victims still receive letters, unsigned, postmarked from different cities, written in familiar handwriting. Always the same closing line, "She was mine, not yours." After the media storm surrounding his trial died down, what haunted investigators wasn't just how Michael Drew killed, it was how deliberately he erased the moment of death. The 5 confirmed victims: Emily Rains, Tasha Viller, June Carlisle, Melanie Fox, and Laura Green all disappeared without struggle. There were no signs of forced entry at their homes. Their phones were wiped, their accounts closed with subtle precision, and their cars often left parked in places they never visited. Drew had a system. Every date followed the same arc. He'd earn their trust, escalate emotional intimacy, and then invite them to his private studio under the pretense of showing them something personal, his art project. Some thought he was a filmmaker. Others believed it was a therapy exercise he was trying to finish post-divorce. No one realized it was their grave. Inside the unit, the women were offered wine, but investigators found residue from slow-acting tranquilizers in the wine bottles recovered near the site. Once sedated, he would strap them gently into the armchair and begin the manipulation phase. This wasn't about panic or fear. He wanted them conscious but pliable. Most of the tapes began with soft music, then Michael entering the frame. He'd sit on a stool, speaking in a quiet voice, sometimes even crying. He'd ask questions like, "Why do you think they stop loving you?" Or, "What makes someone leave for good?" It was a one-man performance, part therapy, part interrogation, all for an audience of one, himself. As the sessions wore on, the women's voices dulled. Some begged, some tried to reason with him, but he always remained calm, tilting his head, smiling with detached fascination. Forensic psychologists say this was his ritual, not a physical kill, but an erasure of identity. He wanted to unmake them emotionally before ending their lives. The final moments were never on tape, but what came after was equally disturbing. Drew used an old ice delivery van with a false bottom, an insulated compartment that kept decomposition at bay for days. He'd drive the bodies out past Lake County, where he buried them in narrow graves no more than 2 feet deep, wrapped in canvas printed with 1950s movie posters. That detail threw investigators off until they realized each poster matched the victim's personality. Laura, a quiet librarian, was buried in canvas from Rebecca. Melanie, a bold fashion student, was wrapped in breakfast at Tiffany's. It was his final act of possession, turning them into characters in his twisted script. Michael's home revealed more. Hidden in plain sight were scrapbooks, but not the kind you'd expect. Each one contained handwritten pages, full of fake letters from the victims to him. "I understand now, Michael," one read. "You were the only one who truly saw me." Experts believe he wrote them post-mortem, pretending they were still alive, still loving him. The line between fantasy and reality wasn't just blurred, it was obliterated. The chilling part? Many of Michael's colleagues and neighbors described him as harmless. He hosted backyard barbecues. He taught a weekend photography class. One student even testified he made everyone feel seen. That, perhaps, was his most terrifying trait. He wasn't hiding in shadows or shouting in rage. He was patient, polished, and surgical with his cruelty. When asked in prison why he filmed them, Michael replied with a soft smile, "People say the truth hurts, but only if you make them look at it." He remains incarcerated at Stateville Correctional Center, isolated from other inmates after 2 attempted attacks. No remorse, no appeals, just silence. But every few months, the Chicago PD still receives anonymous envelopes. Inside, blurry screenshots from unrecovered tapes showing faces they don't recognize. The case may be closed legally, but emotionally, it's still unraveling. Before Chicago could even exhale after the horror Michael Drew left behind, halfway across the world, another monster was carving out his own legacy. Not in a quiet urban apartment, but in the sun-scorched stretches of rural Queensland. And while Drew filmed emotions to death, this man erased people off the map without leaving so much as a photograph behind. They called him Jack Shearer, but no one knew if that was his real name. He drifted across Australia's outback like a ghost in boots, working cattle runs, fixing fences, driving livestock between abandoned railheads. A lean, tanned man in his early 50s with a gravel voice and dead gray eyes. Locals remembered him only for his silence and the smell of diesel and dust that followed him. But from 1993 to 2002, 5 women who were in relationships with him, either romantic or transactional, vanished one by one across different states, different towns, different lives, same outcome. And no one connected the dots for nearly a decade, because Jack never stayed longer than the first bloom of affection. He would meet them in remote pubs, country rodeos, or when their trucks broke down on endless roads. His charm wasn't boyish or loud. It was steady, quiet. He made the women feel safe. "You don't talk much either," one of the surviving women once told police, "so you just sync up. You think you found someone who won't hurt you. Then you blink, and you're in hell." His victims ranged from a 22-year-old single mother working at a petrol station to a 48-year-old widow who owned a small cattle station. And in every case, their disappearances were dismissed as voluntary. Ran off with a trucker, needed a break, probably moved to Perth. That's how Jack liked it. He relied on the chaos of the land, the loneliness of rural life, and the silence of shame. But the way he killed, that's what chilled detectives. He didn't strangle or stab. He starved them, controlled their water, isolated them so fully that the only sound they'd hear for days was the wind off the plains and his boots approaching. One survivor, the only confirmed escape, said Jack kept her in an underground shed used for preserving animal feed. He told her, "I just need you quiet. Just need to think." She survived because a cattle hand happened to notice the locked vent shaft buried in the dirt. But by then, Jack was already gone. He never used his real name for work, always operated in cash, and changed his truck every 6 months. Old Holdens, battered Land Cruisers, whatever he could buy with cash and disappear in. Forensics tied the same kind of coarse rope in every suspected kill site, always wrapped with a certain knot, always hidden beneath loose gravel or under a dry creek bed. 2 skulls were found years later with horseshoe nails driven into the jaw, not to torture, but to prevent identification. The horror wasn't theatrical. It was pragmatic. And that's what made Jack Shearer so terrifying. He didn't kill out of rage or passion. He killed because silence was easier than heartbreak. Because he believed in his own words, "Women ruin the quiet." Authorities believe he might have murdered more than the 5 confirmed victims, possibly up to 15. But with the outback stretching over millions of square kilometers, and the fact that many of his partners were estranged from their families or transient themselves, no full count may ever be known. The last trace of Jack Shearer came from a truck stop CCTV in 2002, driving north toward the Gulf of Carpentaria, alone, smiling slightly, and just like that, he vanished into the dust again. They almost caught him once. In late 2002, a woman named Ellen Grady reported a man matching Jack Shearer's description after he offered her a ride near the Barkley tableland. She was a traveling wildlife researcher whose truck had broken down in the heat. He pulled up in a beat-up silver Nissan Patrol, offered her water, and calmly said, "I'll take you to the next roadhouse." But something about his eyes made her hesitate. She declined. He didn't argue, just stared at her for a second and drove off, leaving behind nothing but spinning dust. Days later, she heard on the radio about a missing woman 3 towns away, same age, similar features, last seen hitchhiking. Ellen went to the police, but with no plate, no name, and no crime yet proven, nothing could be done. That's how Jack operated. One minute he was there, the next he was part of the wind. But what finally blew the case open, or at least cracked it, was a box. In 2006, Workers demolishing an abandoned shearing shed near Cloncurry found a rusted ammo box buried behind the wall cavity. Inside, 8 cassette tapes, a faded photograph of a young woman gagged with her hands tied behind her back, and a stained map with X's marked across northern Queensland. Each X matched a town where a woman had gone missing between 1993 and 2001. The tapes were more disturbing than anyone expected. Not screams, just conversations. Calm interviews Jack had with his victims. He'd ask questions like, "What do you think happens after this?" Or, "Do you remember your father's voice?" His own voice was low, emotionless, curious, like a scientist recording insect behavior. But beneath that calm, you could hear his control. He talked like they weren't people anymore, like he had already buried them. Forensic audio specialists confirmed the tapes weren't doctored and the voices matched known missing persons. But Jack wasn't in the national DNA database, and no confirmed photo of him exists. A sketch based on Ellen Grady's description made it into national news briefly, but without a legal identity, no further traction came. As the years passed, Jack Shearer became a ghost story told by police in rural outposts. "Don't go with strangers," they'd say, especially ones who don't talk much. Some believe he's dead, swallowed by the outback like so many of his victims. Others think he's still out there, older, slower, but just as lethal. Because monsters like him don't need cities. They don't need chaos. They just need time, space, and silence. And in a country as wide and wild as Australia, silence stretches for thousands of miles. Most killers hide behind shadows. Jack Shearer hid behind the blood-stained smile of a charming son. But if Shearer was defined by his arrogance, the man who came next was defined by something colder, a surgical patience that made him nearly invisible. Clay Mercer didn't scream for attention, didn't leave behind theatrical clues or revel in press coverage. Instead, he moved like a whisper through his victims' lives, deliberate, calculated, and invisible until it was far too late. While others left trails, Mercer left silence. And it all began in a town where people believed monsters wore masks. Mercer never wore one. He didn't need to. Because by the time you saw what he really was, it meant he'd already chosen you. Clay Mercer was a licensed trauma surgeon in Sydney, Australia, a man with steady hands, impeccable bedside manner, and a spotless record that hospital administrators flaunted like a trophy. Patients called him a miracle worker. Nurses whispered about his precision, his calm under pressure, his way of handling blood as if it were just another fluid on the chart. But behind that competence was something darker, a fascination with pain and a growing frustration with what he called the waste of second chances. Mercer believed some people didn't deserve to be saved, and over time, he started deciding who those people were. At first, it was only in his head. He'd stand over patients and imagine letting go, skipping one stitch, ignoring one bleed. But soon, imagining wasn't enough. And in 2016, he turned fantasy into his first silent murder. The first known victim was Marissa Cole, a 42-year-old mother of 3 who came in with internal bleeding after a minor car crash. Her injuries were non-fatal. Her recovery was expected. But Mercer reviewed her chart, saw she had a history of DUI arrests, and made a decision. During surgery, he clamped an artery he should have left open, then blamed the cardiac arrest on complications. The death was marked as tragic, but not suspicious. No autopsy was performed. No one questioned the surgeon. And Mercer felt a rush he hadn't felt in years. Not adrenaline, but satisfaction. He'd played God, and no one noticed. Over the next 2 years, 5 more patients would die on Mercer's operating table. All of them shared one thing in common, a history of what Mercer called ethical rot. Thieves, Addicts, cheaters, convicted abusers, people who, in his mind, didn't deserve to walk out alive. But Mercer's real descent began when he started killing outside the hospital. In 2018, his neighbor, a young woman named Emily Rhodes, went missing. She had reported Mercer twice for inappropriate comments. Nothing came of it, but he hadn't forgotten. One night, she vanished from her apartment. Her body was never found. But 6 months later, Mercer took a leave of absence from the hospital and spent 3 weeks alone on a remote property he'd inherited from his grandfather. A property with acres of woods and a private well no one had used in decades. After his return, 2 more women disappeared from the area, a nurse who had rejected his advances, and a social worker he'd once argued with during a patient case. Police never connected the dots. Why would they? Mercer was a respected surgeon, grieving, working long hours. His alibis were loose, but his reputation was airtight. And then came the incident that finally cracked his mask. In early 2020, Mercer's girlfriend, Lily Tran, showed up at the ER with a fractured wrist and deep facial bruising. She refused to say who hurt her. The nurse taking her in noted she looked terrified, flinching when Mercer entered the room. Later that night, Lily died of an unexpected pulmonary embolism. Mercer was the only one with her when it happened. He wrote the report himself, claimed she had hidden pre-existing conditions. The case was closed in 24 hours. But one junior nurse wasn't convinced. She quietly submitted a tip to a friend in the local coroner's office, requesting a confidential review of Lily's toxicology report. The report showed inconsistencies, minute traces of potassium chloride, a substance Mercer had access to and experience with, enough to raise flags. The coroner flagged the report and asked for Mercer's past surgical records. The hospital stalled. By the time authorities got a warrant, Mercer was gone. Police found his house empty, no signs of struggle, but meticulously cleaned. Computers wiped, phones smashed. But what tipped them off was a single slip-up, a receipt for industrial-grade acid purchased under a fake name, left beneath the kitchen sink. It led them to his storage unit on the outskirts of Sydney, and what they found inside turned Mercer from a respected surgeon into one of Australia's most terrifying serial killers. Inside the unit were 9 large sealed drums. Each one contained a dissolving body at various stages of decomposition. Some victims were identified, others never were. But among the remains were dental fragments matching Emily Rhodes, partial remains from Lily Tran, the nurse, the social worker. All the women who had simply said no to Mercer or questioned his control. Alongside the drums were surgical tools, vacuum-sealed gloves, and jars, dozens of them, containing preserved tissue samples, each labeled with a code that investigators later tied to hospital intake numbers. Mercer hadn't just killed, he'd cataloged, recorded, treated his victims like anatomy projects, and worst of all, there were signs he'd planned to expand. Hidden in a file cabinet were folders marked with names, addresses, and psychological profiles. People who had never even met him, but had appeared in court cases, medical boards, or public articles where Mercer believed they'd crossed some moral line. But here's where it gets more terrifying. Mercer had fled 2 days before the search began, and no trace of him has been found since. Interpol placed him on their most wanted list. Australia issued a national alert. His face was printed on every major paper. But Clay Mercer didn't make mistakes. If he's still alive, he's watching. And if not, he left a trail of calculated destruction so chilling, some detectives still refuse to talk about the full contents of his files. His motive wasn't passion. It wasn't impulse. It was judgment, and once he decided you were guilty, your sentence had already begun. Now, just when you think you've seen the worst of it, The next killer dragged love into the equation in a way that left investigators horrified. Clay Mercer's greatest deception wasn't in how he killed, but in how long he convinced everyone he was saving lives. Because for every victim in his storage unit, there were dozens more he had touched, manipulated, and observed, not to heal, but to measure. Investigators believe his entire surgical career was a front for a deeper obsession, studying human vulnerability. And he didn't just track his victims, he documented their responses, cataloged their reactions to pain, to fear, to trust. The folders found in his storage unit weren't just targets. They were research logs, detailed timelines, personal histories. Mercer knew everything about them, their social media, their family trees, even their favorite meals. It wasn't a hit list, it was a curriculum, and Mercer was the professor of cruelty. One of the most haunting revelations came from a hard drive recovered inside a wall in his attic, one he hadn't wiped. It contained over 300 hours of video footage, not of the murders, but of the conversations. Mercer interviewing patients, not on hospital cameras, but on hidden devices he'd installed in private consultation rooms. In these videos, he appeared kind, thoughtful, deeply empathetic. He listened to his patients describe their trauma, their regrets, their worst moments. And when they left the room, he would turn to the camera and speak in a completely different tone, cold, detached. "This one lies well," he said in one recording. Says he regrets the accident, but he's still proud of getting away with it. Category B, not worth saving. Police created a classification map based on his terminology. Category A meant salvageable, B meant disposable, C meant already chosen. These labels appeared throughout his notes, scribbled in margins, encoded in emails, even in his home's Wi-Fi network. Network _C41_B21. At first, it looked like a meaningless tech label, but the C and B corresponded to names in his victim files. Mercer had turned every part of his life into a matrix of judgment. His victims never saw it coming because they thought they were talking to a doctor, not a juror, not an executioner. There was also an emotional component to Mercer's kills that investigators found deeply disturbing. While some killers seek pleasure, Mercer sought something harder to define: equilibrium. His files constantly referred to balance, course correction, and equal weight. He saw his murders as ethical math, a way of resetting the scales. In one file he'd written, "If justice is blind, it needs hands. I am those hands." In another, "Compassion without consequence breeds monsters. I remove them." He saw himself not as a villain, but as a necessary force in a broken world. But one thing broke that balance, one anomaly in his entire methodical process: a woman named Denise Faulkner. Denise was a former patient of Mercer's, admitted in 2019 for complications during pregnancy. She'd suffered from internal bleeding. Mercer had operated, and she survived. But what made her different was that Mercer had visited her after hours, repeatedly. Nurses noticed. He brought flowers, sat with her, talked about his own childhood. There were rumors he was falling in love. Denise later told her husband that Mercer had confessed things to her, dark things, but she never elaborated. She left the hospital and cut off contact. 2 months later, she disappeared. Her car was found at the edge of a ravine. Her body never surfaced. It wasn't until the storage unit discovery that police found a box labeled DF. Inside were drawings, handwritten letters, never sent, a lock of hair, and a note. Balance lost. Must begin again. Denise wasn't just a target. She had shaken something in Mercer, a crack in his cold logic, one that perhaps triggered his sudden spiral. Some profilers believe Mercer's disappearance wasn't an escape. It was a new hunt, not for victims, but for someone to replace what he lost. that singular connection that disrupted his control. In the years since, there have been scattered sightings across Asia, South America, and Canada. A man matching his description seen in clinics, field hospitals, even offering volunteer aid in war zones. But every time authorities arrive, he's gone. And none of the locations have CCTV footage intact. It's as if he erases his trail before it's made. The FBI believes he changes his identity every 6 months. He's a man who knows how to vanish, how to disappear without echo. Some theorists even believe Mercer is dead, that he took his own life to complete the cycle of judgment. But others say he's still out there, building a new classification list, watching, waiting, and choosing. Because Clay Mercer never needed a weapon. He had the scalpel of silence, and the only sound he ever left behind was absence. And just when investigators thought they had seen every type of killer, the proud, the methodical, the twisted, the final name on their list brought something even more terrifying. A man who didn't just destroy lives, he erased them. Clay Mercer believed revenge was a scalpel, slow, surgical, and precise. But the man who followed him didn't believe in precision. He believed in spectacle. Because unlike Mercer, who punished betrayal in private, this man wanted the world to watch. And what made him dangerous wasn't his intelligence or strength. It was the fact that he was ordinary. Not a monster in the shadows, but the kind of man you'd hold the door for. A smiling face in the background. A harmless, "Hey, how's it going?" kind of guy. Until the woman he loved left him. And then, he became the kind of man no one forgets, not because of who he was, but because of what he did next. Tyler Grayson was the kind of man you almost felt sorry for. Grew up in rural Pennsylvania, middle child, nothing too traumatic, nothing too spectacular. He worked maintenance for a mid-tier apartment complex, always wore the same uniform, always clocked in early, rarely talked unless spoken to. People described him as forgettable. Women described him as safe. But the woman he fell in love with, Sierra Hale, didn't want safe, at least not forever. She liked that Tyler was predictable, steady, available. And for 4 years, she let him orbit her world like a loyal planet, always there when she needed a ride, money, dinner, or someone to cry to after yet another breakup. Tyler wasn't her boyfriend, but he wanted to be, and that's what ruined him. You see, Sierra wasn't cruel, not at first. She didn't manipulate Tyler with calculated evil. She just didn't take him seriously. Because when a man like Tyler falls in love, truly obsessively in love, he doesn't always know the difference between kindness and commitment. Between "thanks for being there" and "I want to build a life with you." So when Sierra eventually started dating someone else, a flashy marketing rep who lived in the same complex, Tyler unraveled, quietly at first. He'd stop answering her texts for a few hours, then apologize. He'd do repairs around her unit slower, then faster, then not at all. But the real break came when Sierra stopped calling him at all, not even as a friend. She was happy, posting photos with her new boyfriend, laughing in the same places she used to cry with Tyler. And in his mind, that wasn't just betrayal, it was erasure. A life he thought he was building, deleted. Tyler didn't snap in one moment. He studied, watched, waited. He learned everything about Sierra's new boyfriend. Work hours, gym schedule, even which hallway lights in the building were broken, and how often the security camera on level 3 glitched. He collected gasoline over 6 weeks, not all at once, but in small increments from busted lawnmowers, old cans in the shed, and fuel left in storage units from past tenants. He stored it in sealed paint buckets, hidden beneath boxes labeled Christmas lights. No one noticed. Maintenance had keys to everything. On the night of August 11th at 3:26 a.m., Tyler entered the stairwell, not through the main lobby, that would trip the motion sensors, but from the east side delivery door, which hadn't worked properly in months. He carried 2 buckets, duct-taped shut, punched a hole in each lid with a screwdriver. As he climbed, he tilted the buckets, letting trails of gasoline pour down the steps behind him, like a fuse waiting for a match. He stopped at Sierra's floor, walked directly to her door, and poured the rest of the gas across the welcome mat, the door frame, and under the gap at the bottom. Then he waited. He didn't light the fire immediately. He stood across the hallway, just behind the emergency stairwell, and waited for her light to come on. He wanted her awake. He wanted her to know. And when she did, when her phone screen lit up her window, that's when he struck the match. Not 1, 3, just to be sure. Then he dropped it at the bottom of the stairwell. The fire moved upward, chasing the gasoline trail like a live wire, hitting the apartment corridor in seconds. Within 90 seconds, the hallway was an inferno. Sierra was trapped. The new boyfriend jumped from the window and broke both legs. Sierra burned, screaming. Neighbors tried to help, some with wet towels, others trying to bust through the drywall from the adjacent unit. But it was too late. Smoke filled everything. The fire department arrived 8 minutes later. By then, the hallway cameras had melted, and so had Sierra. Tyler watched from the parking lot. He wore a baseball cap, a faded hoodie, and carried a tool bag. No one noticed. After all, he was maintenance. He helped people escape, handed out wet rags, directed firefighters to the control panel. Everyone said he was a hero. For 48 hours, they called him the brave janitor. Sierra's boyfriend was in the hospital. The police ruled the fire an electrical fault. Case closed. Until one of Sierra's friends, a girl named Cassie, remembered something. 3 days before the fire, she'd seen Tyler in the courtyard, alone. He was pouring something into a plant bed. Not water, not fertilizer. She said it smelled like fuel. She didn't think much of it, until later. When she told the police, they shrugged. No proof, no cause to reopen the case. But Cassie didn't stop. She started posting, subreddits, forums, local news tips. Check the janitor. She even snuck into the storage unit and took a photo of a half-empty gas can, labeled cleaning solution. Finally, one cop, bored or curious, pulled the service logs from Tyler's tablet. There it was, a deletion trail, multiple entries for Unit 312, Sierra's apartment, wiped on the morning of the fire. They called him in, asked him questions. He smiled, said he was heartbroken about Sierra, said he did everything he could. But as the questions got more specific, his time logs, his tool bag, why he entered through the east door, his answers got shorter, then hostile, then silent. A week later, police searched his apartment. They found the paint buckets, the gloves, the matches, and a notebook. Inside, a sketch of the building's layout, marked in red, Sierra's unit. Underneath, "You made me watch you leave. Now I'll make you stay." Tyler Grayson was sentenced to life in prison without parole. In court, he never apologized, never cried, never looked at Sierra's parents. The judge called him emotionally stunted. The prosecutor called him a calculating executioner. But the most chilling part came from Tyler himself. During sentencing, when asked if he had any final words, he said, "I warned her. I was always there. All she had to do was choose me. She didn't." Tyler's trial lasted 9 days. The prosecution brought in arson experts, forensic psychologists, and over 24 witnesses from the apartment complex. What shocked the jury wasn't just the evidence, it was how normal he looked. No wild eyes, no twisted grin. Just a guy in a pale blue shirt, sitting like he didn't belong in a courtroom. The word that kept surfacing in media reports was unremarkable. Reporters didn't know what to make of him. They wanted a monster, a headline with teeth. But Tyler didn't fit the mold. He wasn't charismatic. He wasn't charming. He didn't have a traumatic backstory to explain the flames. What he had was a void, a hole where identity should have been. And the only thing that ever filled it was Sierra. In the weeks following his sentencing, talk shows debated whether Tyler was a cold-blooded killer or just a man broken by rejection. Psychologists offered competing theories. One called him a textbook limerent stalker, someone who mistakes infatuation for intimacy. Another called him an emotional arsonist, obsessed not with love but with being needed. Online forums tore into the case. Reddit threads ballooned with amateur sleuths digging through old maintenance records, social media likes, and blurry screenshots from Sierra's Instagram story 2 weeks before the fire. One user claimed Tyler had liked every photo she posted since 2017, even ones she deleted and re-uploaded. Another said he once saw Tyler sitting in his truck for 3 hours after Sierra left with another man. No proof, just rumors. But the picture they painted was clear. This wasn't a spontaneous crime. It was a blueprint. In prison, Tyler became quiet again. Guards described him as polite, but unsettling. He read the same 3 books on repeat: The Catcher in the Rye, Of Mice and Men, and a beat-up copy of The Art of War. He never joined a gang, never picked fights. He took a job in the laundry room and refused all therapy. When asked why, he said, "There's nothing to fix." In letters to his sister, the only person who still wrote him, he claimed innocence, said the fire was God's will, that Sierra was meant for him, and the world had interfered. Prison psychiatrists flagged the phrase "meant for me" over a dozen times in their reports. One wrote, "Mr. Grayson does not view Sierra Hale as a human being with agency, but as a role that belonged to him. Her death in his mind was not murder, it was reclamation." Over time, Tyler became somewhat of a cult figure online. A small but vocal group of men in incel and MGTOW forums began calling him Saint Grayson. They wore shirts with flame icons, quoted his courtroom line, "All she had to do was choose me." One blog post even claimed he highlighted the consequences of female cruelty, framing Sierra as the villain, a manipulative woman who led him on. Most people were horrified, but that didn't stop the posts, or the fan art, or the disturbing letters he began receiving in prison, mostly from women. Some offered support, some offered sympathy, one offered to marry him. Tyler declined, not out of guilt, but because, as he once told a guard, "There's only one girl worth it, she's already mine, she just doesn't exist anymore." The apartment complex where the fire occurred was eventually sold, renovated and rebranded under a new name. But residents say the 3rd floor still smells faintly of smoke. Unit 312 remains empty. Sierra's parents sued the property management company for negligence, claiming Tyler should never have had access to storage units, fuel, or unrestricted access to the stairwells. The company settled out of court. A small plaque now sits near the mailroom, a silver rectangle with Sierra Hale's name and a quote, "She lit up every room, even the one they burned." But questions still remain. How many times did Tyler hint at what he would do? How many people ignored the warning signs? One tenant remembered Tyler asking her if she ever thought about how fast fire moves. Another recalled him standing outside Sierra's door for 20 minutes one night, just standing, doing nothing. When asked why she didn't report it, the woman said, "He worked there. I figured maybe she called him to fix something. That sentence has haunted her ever since, I figured." And maybe that's the most terrifying part of Tyler Grayson's story. Not that he was evil, but that he looked so ordinary while planning something so catastrophic, that he walked the same halls, waved to the same neighbors, helped the same children find their missing cat, all while carrying the quiet certainty that someone he loved was going to burn. There were no red flags, no screaming fits, no police records or restraining orders. Just a man who believed he was owed something, and a match. In the end, Tyler didn't kill for money. He didn't kill out of rage. He killed because he couldn't accept being unloved, couldn't accept that someone he devoted his entire identity to could just walk away. That kind of betrayal doesn't just break a man like Tyler, it erases him. And in return, he erased her. It wasn't vengeance, it was symmetry. She destroyed him quietly, so he destroyed her loudly, permanently. Today, Tyler Grayson is housed in SCI Phoenix, a maximum security prison in Pennsylvania. He remains in solitary confinement due to safety concerns. He has not spoken to the press. His name has been banned from several forums for inciting violence. But his story remains one of the most unsettling examples of what happens when unrequited love mutates into entitlement, when affection turns into obsession and devotion becomes destruction. And the scariest part? Tyler wasn't crazy. He was just waiting. And when love didn't answer, he lit a match. They didn't kill for money, or power, or chaos. They killed because love lied, and betrayal rewrote their purpose. Each one started with a promise: forever, always, only you. But when those promises shattered, they didn't grieve. They punished. Because some hearts don't break quietly. They explode.